I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to the free main three things for your successful FDA EMEA project. So when I talk about an FDA EMEA project, I mean an operations project supporting a product regulated by these agencies or other country agencies very similar to them like Anvisa. Um, Operations projects can cover development projects, projects to make the first GMP lot, projects to launch the first lot to stock, projects that cover the full gamut from development to launching the first lot to stock, projects to purchase and qualify capital equipment or upgrade facilities or to do process improvements. But all of these are for projects supporting products that are regulated by one of these agencies. And what makes such projects successful? In my opinion, what makes them successful is that when they're over, the team looks fondly back on the memory of working on the project and actually may still hang out with some of the team members socially, as opposed to being relieved that the project is over and the huge indulgence on their time has passed. So today's course is about how you, as a project manager for such a project, can make one of these projects successful. So I'm Annette Johnston, your course leader today. You can see my LinkedIn address if you want to look at my biography, as well as my website. You can contact me in either place. I've copied the biography from my website. Um, I guess in more general terms, I am a trained chemical engineer. I started out doing equipment and facility projects like a chemical engineer. I am a linear, logical chemical engineer thinker with pretty good grasp of the details that need to go together for a project. I spent most of my career working in one large corporation, Abbott Laboratories, on all different kinds of projects. I moved on from capital projects really to working more on product troubleshooting, process improvement, and eventually product launch projects. And then when I retired, I moved on to be a contractor project manager for other companies working on the same kind of projects. And it was in working at the other companies that I began to see the ideas that I'm going to share with you today crystallize about the soft skills beyond all those wonderful logical details that are involved in putting together a complex technical project, but are just as important as the technical details for a complex technical project. They are the data and the details that actually make the project successful. So I'm going to ask you to put it in the chat what kind of experience you have, but I actually have a very limited audience today. So I am going to give this presentation as if I'm giving it to new project managers, new to the practice altogether, or perhaps certified project managers who are familiar with communication plans and risk registers, but might need a little bit of an insight into how to use that for a project for a regulated product. So what is different about regulated projects or regulated projects for regulated products? I hope we don't get caught up in the semantics. The difference is the documents. Everything about a regulated product has a document showing that what was involved was suitable for its intended use. That includes the people executing the documents, the people executing the testing, the people executing the research and the manufacturing. And they need to be using equipment that has been proven suitable for the work they're doing, using materials that are appropriate, tested according to a method that has been shown to be reliable test after test after test. So let's talk a little bit more about the people. You, as a project manager, may not need to track the training documents that are involved in showing that the people that work on your project are qualified. But it is helpful to know whether they are, and particularly if they're new or they're new to the equipment they're going to be working on. It should go without saying that their management knows to train them, but sometimes a little informal conversation about their training might be helpful. Secondly, regarding the equipment. So all equipment has to be qualified. So that means there's documents related to the specifications for the equipment when it was purchased. There's usually some protocol for the qualification of the equipment once it's been installed. Often there are documents related to the calibration of the equipment, which should be part of the regular maintenance documents for that company. If it's a new piece of equipment that's going to be used for your project, all of that time for getting that done should be included in your project. Likewise, the materials. Materials used in a project like this have specific specifications. I guess that's a double name, but the specifications are important. And you need to be able to buy the material reliably every time and have that material meet those specifications. Not only that, you'll find that usually you have to certify that the supplier of that material has a quality system such that if there is any change to the process, or their supplier, that they will make you aware that the material has changed, and that they have a system in place to be able to perform any investigations related to their product if you find that it behaves differently once you receive it. The testing documents have to be in place normally before the first manufacturing. The testing documents are qualifications of the methods that are going to be used to test the product to show that it meets the specifications it needs to make after it's manufactured. So there's typically several steps involved in putting those documents together. There's usually some development of the method, and then there's going to be a written protocol that will be the test of the reliability of the method, the minimization of the variability in the method. There's several standards for testing methods, as well as the execution of that protocol and the generation of the report and the approval of the report. All of those steps are going to be needed to be included in your project for each method. And then we come to the final process itself. If your project is going to be in the later stages of the product development, such as now you're at the point where you're going to get close to filing the process, and you're running the final 3 runs to show that your process is in control, you're going to have a validated process. And those 3 runs are going to be the basis of those validations. And just like for analytical methods, there's going to have to be a protocol, an execution of the 3 runs, and then a report that is approved. And the time for doing that needs to be included in your project. So you may find that by the time you plan for all these documents, there's almost as much time planned for the documents as there was for the actual execution of the technical portions of the project, like the research and the production runs, and perhaps the first lot to stock runs. And we're going to talk about how to manage that, because often when you take the first look, the project looks like it's going to take too long. And yet, you need to respect everyone's time where it takes to put these documents together. So I talked about what a successful project is. A successful project is a project where everyone looks back with fond memories. What they don't have fond memories of are surprises. So here I've listed what sort of pain the project brings about. It's often extra work and the stress about the extra work. But the consequences of the surprises, in spite of the fact that you're going to try to remediate it with extra work or extra resources to do the extra work, are also listed here. And when you see these consequences or you think about them at the beginning of your project, it's important to start listing them in the risk register, except for like the sponsor being embarrassed or the negative career negative career impact is not something I don't think you should list in the risk register. But other risks like delayed deliveries and missed launch windows should be listed in the risk register. And perhaps if you can find early indicators that you're going to have a delayed delivery or a missed launch window, that should be in your risk register. But the point here is when a surprise happens, it's important to have planned your project so that it's not an embarrassing surprise. It's not a surprise where someone feels like someone wasn't doing their job or someone was at fault. A surprise that comes from the execution of the project where everybody is performing as they committed is one thing. It's another thing when you have a surprise which looks like a failure. And failures always have negative career impacts and, well, unplanned failures, unforeseen or portrayed as possible risk failures have negative impacts. So what can we do to minimize surprises? I've listed 3 main mistakes, and these are the 3 main things. The first one is you didn't identify all the activities. The second one is that everyone didn't know what to do next. And the third one is the sponsor was unpleasantly surprised about some adversity. So let's go back to the first one. Somehow everyone wasn't talked to identify all the activities, which means all the documents and all the touch times related to each document. Remember, there is a draft, there's usually a review, sometimes there's an execution, sometimes there's a correction of the reviewed document, and then there's an approval, and each person gets to have time to do the approval for every document there is. So it's important to understand what documents there are and who is going to be responsible for reviewing and approving them. So how do you know that you have a complete list? Because you should have a complete list ideally before the kickoff of the project. If you have to add extra documents after the project is kicked off, it's only because the team identified them later and everybody understands that it wasn't because you ignored them or they felt like you ignored them in asking about the documents before the kickoff. So certainly you're going to talk to the team members that are assigned to the project, or perhaps the team members that you chose, about what documents are going to be related to the project coming up. I would list every single one of them as you're discussing them with each team member, as well as understanding how many people are going to be touching that document and how many phases of the document there are. And then I would go to that team member's management, because they may have a different perspective on how those documents are managed, or whether there's other documents that might have been intuitive or invisible to the original team member you talked to. So again, I would talk to not only the team member, but the team member's management. Also helps to talk to your direct management, because your supervisor may have experience with the projects enough to know what sort of documents they would expect to see at each phase, and you can do a double check with that. The other person to double check with is the sponsor. Even if they are a very distant sponsor, you should have a face-to-face, even if it's a virtual face-to-face meeting with the sponsor to talk about a variety of things, but which we'll get to in number 3. But one of the things you're going to be talking about is the documents involved, so they can start getting a feel for why the team is the size that it is and where the risks might be in getting some of those documents done. And as I just said, it's best to do these in face-to-face meetings. If you can't do it in a face-to-face meeting or virtual meeting, you can do it by email. But there has to be some visible list that both of you are working on so that you walk away with something you can put into a timeline. The second thing is, the second main mistake, the second thing for success is to make sure everybody knows what they're supposed to do next. We cannot have a surprise where somebody believes that someone wasn't doing their job. So, how do these surprises occur? They often occur when you're holding a project meeting and everyone agrees that they're going to do something next, and then they go back to their department only to find that there's an emergency. And even though they intended right when they left the project to work on your project, they don't, because their management assigned them to work on something else. Or they listened to what needed to be done at the meeting, and they knew that it impacted negatively the list of things they already had to do, so much so that there was a very low probability they were going to get to that activity. But they were secretly hoping that one of the weaknesses that was mentioned in the project meeting is going to happen, and suddenly they're going to be off the hook to do it because something's going to happen. And depending on how that risk was verbalized at the project meeting, they may feel pretty strongly that there's no reason to work on it because it's going to be a waste of time because this other thing's going to happen. Or there is a task listed in the timeline and it's brought up at a project meeting. It actually involves several people working on it, but one person is listed and that person knows that they can't do it unless the other person has their input, but that's not articulated at the meeting. The person agrees to what they're going to do, but then they don't do it because they didn't get the input that they expected. That's the second mistake. The third mistake is to rely on the reporting that is normally in place to sponsors about projects. You'll find that if you're in a company of any size, there's going to be some kind of monthly or quarterly project review where you're going to be asked to submit a slide with a status. Often the status has a little color on it like green, yellow, or red. And in addition, you may have to submit a little report, which then gets combined with others for a manager to report up to their management. It is important that when you send in that sort of status, that if there is some kind of adversity that's going to turn the status to yellow or red, yellow being warning and red meaning we're going to miss the timeline. We've already missed the timeline. The sponsor needs to be tuned into that immediately. They should know that before you send out anything, that talks about the adversity and what you're going to do about the adversity so that they know what the adversity is and they agree with the remediation that you have in mind for the adversity before any conversation about the adversity happens anywhere. It is very bad form to wait until one of these status meetings to report the adversity. It's actually better to have that quick meeting with the sponsor and start having the conversations and doing whatever remediation was outlined if it was in the risk register before one of these status meetings, and then just report that you're performing according to the risk management plan at the status meeting. So let's talk a little more detail about how to take care of these mistakes. I spent a lot of time on number one, but we'll spend a little more time. So making sure that you have every document. I talked about talking to the team members and their management, but there's another way of looking at sort of making a cross-check to make sure you have all the documents. One is to check your quality policies and just think about whether you have those documents in your timeline already, because you most likely, if you're in a company that makes a regulated product, you had quality training, and these documents were part of your quality training somewhere. If they weren't, then you have a contact that they give in the training where you're supposed to contact to ask about the documents. And that might be another way to make a cross-check that all the quality documents are on the list. Then there's other documents that are related often to manufacturing and procurement and maintenance of equipment. And those are also listed in policies that you may be trained on, but it's often easier just to go straight to the maintenance group or straight to the group that manages the equipment or is buying the equipment, like engineering, to make sure that you have all those documents in the list, sort of as a cross-check after your conversation with the team members. And finally, how do you figure out the time for each member when you put it in the timeline for each document? So I usually use the rule of a 20-page document versus a 100-page document. I feel like if it's a 20-page document, I give each person that's going to touch it 3 hours. Not that they're going to spend 3 hours on it, but they can certainly spend no more than 2 minutes a page, more than likely, maybe less, depending on whether it's an approval or a review. But if they're going to approve a review, they get 3 hours. If it's a 100-page document, they should get more like a day to look at the whole document, because it's going to take half a day just to read the words without making any decision about what they think about the words. And so that means, for example, if you have 5 people reviewing a document, you've just added 1 week for review of X document into your timeline. The other thing is to make sure all the handoffs are accounted for. So if there's going to be a review in manufacturing, and then it has to get posted in some other system before, say, quality has to review it, depending on the size of the corporation and how global it is, there may be an actual transfer step into a different system. That needs to be included in the timeline as well, because suddenly where it looks like, 5 people can approve something in a day, particularly if you found a way to streamline that, you might find that that review can't happen till the transfer happens. So once you include all these documents, as I said earlier, you may find that your end date is months after the end date for the business requirements for the launch of the product. And so that's when it's going to mean that you're going to meet with your team and develop trust in your team by showing respect for their time. And yet you need their input now, how to crash this timeline with everything we've just put in it in order to meet the business requirement end date. And that brings us to thing number 2. The second thing for the successful project that addresses mistake number 2. You have to build trust and engage your team. Your team has to trust each other now and commit to doing what needs to be done in the most likely more aggressive time frame than they would like in order to meet the business goal. So I've listed what trust looks like. And I've also listed a way to measure usually what trust doesn't look like. And if you're seeing this in your meetings, then you're going to keep managing the project and make sure things are done when they're supposed to be done. But I would spend a little time on addressing these issues. The first one is everyone coming to your regular team meetings? You probably had a really big group come to your kickoff meeting, but now a smaller group is coming to the team meetings. Now, you may have agreed on that at the kickoff meeting, but if some department or important representative of the project is consistently not showing up at the meeting, you need to find out why not. It could be because they have a standing conflict with your meeting time. And if that's true, then the conversation needs to be had whether they can send a delegate or whether they commit to reading the minutes and doing the action items that are assigned to them, because you're going to send an email to them saying, note, this is the action item assigned to you in the minutes, or whether you need to change the meeting time. Changing the meeting time is always a challenge because likely you picked it to accommodate as many team members as you could going forward. But if it really seems like the project is going to be at risk if you don't have this person at the meetings, you need to think about changing the meeting time. During the meeting, if you come upon asking for status on what should have been completed according to the timeline, or what should be completed in the timeline based on some agreed look-ahead period, and you get silence for the commitment to that particular task in the timeline, I would start right away by asking someone if they could commit to at least part of it, particularly if there's a handoff involved. They have to answer your question, and it's just the start of the conversation to get down to why they can't commit to it and if you should be asking someone else to be there. I'm going to talk about this again in the next slide, but you need to meet your team beyond the regular team meetings. You don't need to do it every week, but you need to find a way to stop by, ideally in person if you can do it, by Zoom if they're across the ocean or something, or by a phone call, just to see how they're doing with the project. Usually the best way to do it is in the context of following up on a task that's just about due. But we'll go into why that's important. And then finally, if you feel like you're sending minutes out to, I don't know, 10 or 20 people that should be in the meeting, and you can detect by talking to the team members that they haven't read the minutes, then you need to understand why they don't feel that they have time to read the minutes. And we'll just go into all of that in the next slide. So, mistake number 2 is not to have your team engaged with trust. So this number 1 is an extra meeting, actually, depending on the size of your company. I mean, if it has one product, you probably don't need to have this. But if you're working in a large company and your project is one of many that will be launching or using the same resources for quality, analytical, and manufacturing in the same time frame as other projects that have deliverables that will come up at those quarterly meetings. You need to help those teams understand what they need to do next. And so I would suggest meeting with them to do that. So if they don't have their own meetings internally where they're already trying to figure out what to do next, then you need to hold one with them yourself, to tell them for your project what you need next. Usually, though, they have their own meeting deciding what to do next. And it's important that you get invited to that meeting and that you have a slide or a time during that meeting where they look to you and ask you to confirm that their plans for working on what you need next are being met. You've already confirmed their time is respected if you made the complete list of documents from step 1. And you've reinforced that if you had the meeting with them to find a way to crash the program in a way that they feel comfortable with, and you've already reflected that in the timeline. But the key is that they were involved in the crash of the timeline and not just their management involved in the crash of the timeline. If it turns out that the management's not comfortable with them being involved in that conversation, then this is one of those opportunities to do the walk by or stop by and say, we're having this conversation, and this is how management is seeing it. And just so you know, I think this is how it's going to be compressed, and talk with them about it then, which again is sort of a rehash of item number 3, which is strategically holding those unofficial conversations. Usually the unofficial conversations can be done by making a phone call or paying an in-person visit instead of just sending an email or a text. Emails and text works most of the time because everybody's time is precious. But every so often, decide that with this person, you're going to make this an in-person visit so that you can look in their face and get a feel for how they are feeling about the project, and that they're actually committing to the item that you would have just emailed about anyway. And the other way the team will know that you have tried, or you have understood the value of their time, is to add time, lead time, for the parts of the project that feel the most risky after speaking with your sponsor and with your team and their management. I know we just talked about crashing the timeline for some things, but I think it is helpful if the team also agrees where the weak spots are in the timeline and where you can add a day here, a day there, so that there's a little extra time to get the more difficult items together, perhaps because it's going to take a second review, or it's hard to get time in a meeting with some resource because there's only one of them. Whatever it is, just if you can include that little extra time in the timeline, everybody will be happier for it. Which brings us to the third thing, and that is training your sponsor. You'll see I put a superhero in the background because it's important that you make your sponsor feel like a superhero. This is not just a rote thing, your project that they're working on. This is a thing that you need them to influence for. If there is suddenly going to be a need to rent something, to get contractors for something, to ask for resources from another department, because something did go wrong according to the risk register, and now we have to pull the trigger to actually do the remediation. So in order to do this training, and I've mentioned this before, you need to go through the timeline with them and Get agreement with them about where the weak spots are, those ones where you're adding the extra couple of days, and where you have the risk register showing when you might need to rent equipment or buy contractors or ask for other department people to cover what would otherwise be called a surprise, but it's not a surprise because it was on the risk register. In order to communicate with your sponsor when one of these things happens, you have to have an elevation plan. Even if this person is 2 levels above you and you have to go through an admin before you can talk to this person, there needs to be an agreement that you can text them, or the admin knows that if you call them and say it's urgent, they need to find them immediately, that a risk on the register has triggered and you're going to need a decision from them about a resource change that day. Set up the system ahead of time. They see the risk register. They're already sort of prepped on what the budget request or resource request is going to be. And they know that if you're trying to reach them, the news won't be good, but they'll be sure to find you so that they can know what it is before everyone else does. And I guess the last thing, which probably goes without saying, but when you send those slides with the green, yellow, red, or you're going to have a special emergency meeting because now you have to get an extra budget or an extra resource, you let them in on the deck you're going to use for that meeting or the agenda you're going to use for that meeting before you send it out. They will appreciate that you're respecting their image in the company. Okay. So, to summarize, the 3 things you need to do to avoid surprises is to make sure that every activity is in the timeline, that you have commitment and trust in your team to execute the timeline, and that the sponsor is trained and is ready for action when things go badly and is ready to take the credit when things go well. So I'm seeing there's a small group here. I allow time for questions, but in the interest of the recording, I think I'm going to cut the presentation short. I hope this was useful for you, and watch for other courses in the future from AAJ Project Consulting. The first one is going to be is a $350 course, Managing Your Regulated Project, which will include the information I just shared with you now, but with more detail, including how to set up a timeline. I'll actually pull up a Microsoft project timeline, and I'll have some handout timelines to share with you. How to set up those extra meetings with the shared services people, and some more details about how to manage before the kickoff. So for $350, you get the course with the QA. You get these handouts. You can copy this link here and go straight to the registration funnel, which at this point includes some questions about use, which is really going to help me put together the course. But if you don't want to spend time answering the questions, most of them are essay questions, except for one radio button question, just type in NC to skip through to the actual registration. If you have any difficulties with the registration, or you have questions about the course or the registration, please contact me at this email or go to my webpage and click Contact Annette there. Thank you for your time. I hope you have a successful project.